Good morning. I'm Stephen Bliss, Director of Strategic Communications at the California Budget and Policy Center. We're glad to have you with us today for our webinar discussing the Governor's May revision and what it means for this year's budget debate as it moves forward. Just a quick housekeeping note, we will be posting the full slide deck from today's webinar on our website immediately after today's webinar, and we'll also be emailing out a link to the event page and the slide deck and the full video and recording to everybody later today. And so with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Chris Haney, our Executive Director, to get today's webinar started. Chris?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning to talk about the Governor's May revision and some of the key proposals and issues that it contains. We're very happy to have you here with us, and we're certainly going to leave some time for questions. Let's talk a little bit about this webinar first. It's part of a policy perspective series that we have been offering this year that features in-person and online events that provide expert analysis and insights on key questions facing California. And we'll have more of these events coming up in the coming months, including other webinars and some in-person events. So we hope that we'll be hearing from you or seeing your names online or meeting you in person, talking more about some of these issues going forward. For those of you that are active in social media, if you want to post about this, you can use a couple of different hashtags. Hashtag policy perspectives, that's for the series of events, and hashtag CA budget, which is sort of a general hashtag that covers a lot of issues around the California budget and which we regularly post to. So you're going to be hearing from a number of us here today, from me, of course, and also from a number of my colleagues, Scott Graves and Kristen Schumacher. And you'll also be hearing from Jonathan Kaplan, Sarah Kimberlin, and Alyssa Anderson, and we'll be running through a number of the elements of the governor's proposed budget for 2017 and 18 and how it's different from January, and trying to do that relatively quickly and then take your questions in further detail as needed. So let's talk a bit about context and top lines as a place to start. In our first look analysis that we released earlier this week, we sort of gave you the elevator version of the speech if people are asking you about the budget, which is the Governor's May revision makes several improvements, but still reflects some underlying uncertainty about potential federal actions that we still don't know a lot about. And so let's start with some of those federal actions as context, because the scope of the possible here is certainly being determined in many respects by the unknowns at the federal level. And so we know we have this continued prospect of big cuts and changes coming at the federal budget level. Next week will be a big week in that regard. It appears that the administration is still slated to release the details of their proposed budget next week on Tuesday the 23rd. And a score on the House repeal and replacement of the Affordable Care Act had been due out on Monday the 22nd and has been rescheduled for Wednesday, May 24th. So on Tuesday and Wednesday next week, there'll be some big news where we'll know more about federal implications for California. Other context what state leaders are dealing with here is that state revenues have been coming in somewhat stronger than projected, particularly since January, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then despite 8 years of economic growth in the state, we know we still have various key services and support still operating at diminished levels, in many respects levels still well below where they were prior to the Great Recession, and we have many parts of the state that are still very uneven in terms of the economic growth they've experienced and where people are having struggles making ends meet. So what's in the governor's budget? I gave you the sort of elevator speech version from us shortly. This is sort of the longer version that, you know, if you want to tell people over the dinner table or make people scared and run away from you at parties, here's the sort of shorter version. The governor's budget forecast revenues that are more than $2 billion higher than in January. It's worth noting that those are still lower than where he had projected in the enacted budget last year. We'll come back to that issue. The funding that those additional revenues allow the state to allocate goes into K through 14 education both through the Proposition 98 guarantee and through an allocation above and beyond that guarantee. We'll talk more about that as well. The proposal unpauses a multi-year plan to reinvest in childcare and preschool that was included in last summer's package and that was paused in the January proposal. It includes funds to lessen impacts of the in-home support services cost shift to counties that the governor had proposed in January, and otherwise doesn't contain any new investments in many of the key services that help families make ends meet. And we'll talk about all of these issues in more detail here in the coming slides. So let's talk about some of those details. Here are some of the key components. We're going to start on that revenue side. It's worth remembering whenever we talk about changes to the state's fiscal outlook and a proposed state budget, that all the proposals are looking at 3-year periods or 3-year budget windows. There's the focus we usually have on next year's proposed budget, in this case 2017-18, but we're also updating what we know for the current fiscal year, in this case 2016-17, and we're sort of finalizing the numbers in terms of what we know happened in terms of revenues and spending in the prior fiscal year, in this case 2015-16. So we're looking at a 3-year budget window, and the governor's projection says that there will be 2.5 billion more revenues than had been anticipated. Those revenues are across the whole budget window. It's important to note, while that's good news since January, they're still significantly lower by 3.3 billion than where they had been projected in last year's enacted budget. That's important context to remember, just in the sense of how the economic and fiscal outlook for the state is doing. But in terms of just 2017-18, the revised forecast means that there's a $400 million shortfall for 2017 and 18, and that's significantly smaller than the shortfall in January, which had been 1.6 billion. And so that puts some more dollars on the table that can be allocated going into the next fiscal year. Now, one of the key ways that the state's systems are set up to do that now is by emphasizing building up state reserves as required by Proposition 2 in 2014. Total state reserves under the governor's proposal would be $10.1 billion, which is mostly allocated through an $8.5 billion total set of deposits over several years in the rainy day fund. And the way Proposition 2 works, just so that you can understand the background here, is that a percentage of the state's general fund revenues are set aside every year into the rainy day fund and to paying down debt. When capital gains exceed 8% of the state's general fund tax revenues, the excess also gets deposited into rainy day funds and paying down debt. And for the first 15 years, through the year 2029-30, half of those dollars have to be used for paying down the state's debts and liabilities. So that's sort of the overview of the structure of Proposition 2. What that means for 2017 and 18 is that we'd be making a $1.8 billion deposit into the rainy day fund. The technical name for that is the budget stabilization account. Another $1.8 billion, the half that's required by Proposition 2 that I just mentioned, would be required to be used for paying down the state debts. When you take the budget stabilization account and you take that $1.8 billion and you add it to prior years, you get to an $8.5 billion total in the budget stabilization account by the close of the next fiscal year. There's also one other reserve fund called the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties. The governor's proposal would allocate $1.6 billion to that fund, which isn't a change from January. And so if you add the $8.5 billion to the 1.6 across those two funds, you get over $10 billion set aside for the rainy day fund and for other reserves. So that sort of summarizes that piece. The other piece of this that we need to talk about is constitutional requirements about funding that goes to K-12 schools and community colleges through our Proposition 98 guarantee. And so I'm now pleased to introduce Jonathan Kaplan, our senior policy analyst, who covers those issues.
Good morning, everybody. As many of you know, Proposition 98 is the state's constitutional guarantee of a minimum level of funding for K-12 schools, community colleges, and the state preschool program. In most years, the state funds at this minimum funding level. Thus, in reality, Prop 98 really functions more as a ceiling rather than a floor for how much the state spends on schools each year. However, the governor's May revision has proposed to spend more money for the state schools and community colleges in 2017-18 than Prop 98's minimum funding guarantee would otherwise provide. Specifically, the May revision proposes a Prop 98 funding level of $74.6 billion in 2017-18, which is $1.1 billion more than the level assumed in January and $600 million more than the guarantee would require if the state funds at the minimum funding level. Due to the way that the May revision crafts Prop 98 spending, the governor has eliminated his January proposal to defer $860 million for the local control funding formula from 2016-17 to 2017-18. The LCFF is the state's main K12 funding formula. Had this deferral occurred, it could have forced some school districts to make tough choices to fill the gap in state funding, such as borrowing money or cutting programs. Instead, the May revision provides more LCFF funding in the budget year than was proposed in January. Specifically, the May revision provides a total of $1.4 billion in 2017-18 LCFF funding, and that's $660 million more than the governor proposed in January. While some may raise questions about why the state would provide more dollars for K-14 schools than is required by Prop 98, the May provision proposes contingencies that will allow the state to reduce the 2017-18 funding level, especially if revenues come in lower than expected or the Prop 98 guarantee falls. For example, the May revision proposes $1 billion in one-time K-12 spending in 2017-18 that would not actually be provided to schools until May of 2019. This $1 billion in one-time funding is approximately $400 million more than the May revision over-appropriates to the 17-18 Prop 98 funding level. By not providing these one-time dollars to school districts until near the end of the 2018-19 school year, the governor's May revision is sending a message to school districts not to count on these dollars in 2017-18, despite the increased Prop 98 funding level in the budget year. And if the Prop 98 guarantee falls in 2017-18, the state can rescind its promise for some or all of this money and also reduce the 17-18 Prop 98 funding level without suspending the minimum guarantee in that year. However, if the state provides more Prop 98 funding in 2017-18 than is required by the minimum funding guarantee, that over-appropriation would mean increases in the Prop 98 funding guarantee moving forward, as each year's annual Prop 98 funding level is the basis for calculating the minimum funding level guaranteed in future years. And with that, I'll give it back to Stephen or to Scott.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is Stephen, and thanks for those comments on K-12. We're now going to move to Scott Graves, our Director of Research, who's going to talk about the in-home supportive services, cost shift, Prop 56, and how they fit into this year's budget. Scott?
Well, good morning, everyone. As I'm sure many of you are aware, probably the major issue on the human services side of the budget relates to in-home supportive services. That program helps around 500,000 seniors and people with disabilities in California to remain safely in their own homes, avoiding more costly out-of-home care. The costs of the program are shared by the federal government, the state government, and California's 58 counties. So without getting into all the gory details here, it gets very complicated. The thing to keep in mind here is that back in January, the governor made a policy choice as allowed under current law that essentially will shift a large share of costs for the in-home supportive services program that are currently borne by the state onto county budgets. The estimate of that cost back in January was over $600 million in the first year, 2017-18, and some estimates said that cost would rise to over $1 billion in the coming fiscal year. So in other words, counties would be taking on well over $1 billion in additional costs for IHSS. They pointed out immediately that they did not have sufficient revenues to cover those additional costs that were assumed in the governor's budget. And they noted that they would probably need to make very substantial cuts to their own services at the local level in order to free up dollars to fund these additional costs being pushed down from the state level. The governor in January acknowledged that this was a problem, but he did not provide a solution at the time. So fast forward to the May revision. After several months of meetings, discussions, negotiations between the governor's staff and the counties. The May revision does include a plan to help mitigate but not entirely eliminate these new costs that will be shifted down to the county level. So just to highlight three things about this relatively complex plan that has many moving pieces. The first is, yes, there will still be a cost shift to counties. In 17-18, starting this coming July, that shift will be around $600 million. But the May revision provides a number of ways to try to mitigate the impact of that shift on counties. A couple ways that I can tell you right now without getting into all the details. One is the state would use general fund dollars, send them down to the counties to help counties offset some of these new costs for IHSS, starting at around $400 million general fund next fiscal year, ramping down to around $150 million ongoing. So that's one way the state tries to solve counties' problems. Another way is the state says, okay, counties, you for 5 years can use some special fund dollars that currently fund other services to fund the IHSS program. So that, in a sense, puts a squeeze on those other programs, but it does allow counties to make up a bit more of the ground they lose in terms of the shift coming down from the state level. So important point here is that the plan in the governor's May revision doesn't entirely eliminate this cost shift. Counties have indicated for the first couple of years it will be manageable. It sounds like they can deal with the impact of the shift on their budgets, but they're very concerned about years 3 and beyond. You know, getting into the 2020s, they feel that the way the governor's proposal is structured, that they're going to face substantial cost increases each year for IHSS that will really pinch their own budgets and leave them possibly having to cut other services at the local level in order to make up the funding. So what they're saying right now to the legislature is essentially, look, whatever you do on this issue, make sure that you open it up in a couple more years. Let's revisit this. Let's come back to it so we can look at what's happened over the prior 2 years and decide what makes sense as a long-term solution going forward. So that's what's going on with IHSS. On the health side of the budget, again, many of you know, the major debate here revolves around how to use the dollars provided by Proposition 56 tobacco tax revenues within the Medi-Cal program. Voters approved Prop 56 last year. It imposes a $2 per pack increase on cigarettes and an equivalent increase on other tobacco products, including electronic cigarettes that deliver nicotine. Those increases took effect on April 1st, and the governor is estimating that through next June, Prop 56 will raise new revenues of around $1.8 billion, so almost $2 billion coming from this measure over the next 5 quarters, and $1.3 billion will be going to the Medi-Cal program. Now, so what's the controversy? Well, the controversy is the governor is arguing that these new Prop 56 revenues should be used essentially to fund typical year-over-year cost increases in the Medi-Cal program, essentially the kinds of things we would normally fund with our state general fund dollars. Instead of using these new Prop 56 funds to pay for, quote, improved payments within Medi-Cal for healthcare services as Prop 56 requires. So the governor argues, naturally, that his interpretation of Prop 56 is consistent with the intent of the measure. Others disagree. Provider associations for doctors and dentists, argue that Prop 56 fairly narrowly requires these new dollars to be used for reimbursement rate increases for providers within the Medi-Cal program, at a minimum, doctors and dentists. Other organizations, for example, healthcare advocacy organizations, argue that actually you can probably interpret Prop 56 a little more broadly. Yes, we can use the money for provider rate increases, but perhaps we could also use it to restore some Medi-Cal benefits that were eliminated back in 2009 as a result of the recession. And maybe we can use some of the dollars, these groups argue, to help provide health care coverage to low-income, undocumented adults between the ages of 19 and 26, essentially building on the state's decision from a couple years to extend Medi-Cal coverage to youth up to age 19. So I have a feeling that this is putting the legislature and the governor on a collision course over this issue, and we'll see how it plays out over the next few weeks. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And we're going to move in a second on to other areas of the budget, including early childhood, early care and education. But just as a couple quick notes, logistically, as a reminder, we will be making all the slides available on our website right after the webinar, and also emailing this out to the full group of attendees later in the day. And then also, I did want to mention that people can ask questions. We're going to have a lot of time for questions at the end of the prepared remarks, and there's if you see the questions pane on your GoToWebinar panel, you can use that to send questions to us, or also feel free to tweet any questions to us directly to us at Cal Budget Center or via the hashtag policy perspectives. And so with that, I'm happy to bring on Kristen Schumacher to talk about early care and education in the May revision. Kristen.
Thanks, Stephen. So as some of you may know, California's Child Care and Development System is composed of subsidized child care and the California State Preschool Program. These programs are open for low and moderate income families with incomes below the income eligibility limits. State policymakers dramatically cut funding for these programs during and after the Great Recession. They slashed about $1 billion in overall funding, which, among other things, resulted in the loss of about 1/4 of the subsidized slots in California, or about 110,000 slots. So policymakers have been incrementally reinvesting over the past few years, and in last year's budget agreement, state policymakers included a multi-year plan to continue to reinvest in the system. However, in January, the governor proposed a pause in this multi-year investment in 17-18 due to lower than expected revenues. The good news is, as Chris mentioned, the May revision actually reverses course and unpauses the multi-year plan, and in addition, makes some new investments in the state's child care and development system. So specifically, the May revision updates provider payment rates and then adds full-day state preschool slots. So first I'll cover the reimbursement rates, and then I'll cover slots. So for a bit of context, there are two kinds of subsidized child care providers. There are those that contract directly with the state, and then there are those that accept vouchers as a form of payment from families. So providers that contract with the state are reimbursed according to the standard reimbursement rates, or the SRR, some people might call it. And then voucher-based providers are reimbursed based on the market rate survey that the state conducts periodically. So this is called the Regional Market Rate Survey, or some might call it the RMR or the RMR survey. So the May revision boosts the standard reimbursement rate for contract providers by including the 5% increase that was part of last year's budget agreement, and then it actually increases the standard reimbursement rate by an additional 6%, both of which are effective on July 1. Voucher-based providers are also going to see an increase in rates, and the May revision actually updates it to the 2016 Regional Market Rate Survey, or holds rates harmless in case rates would have decreased. So the May revise actually adds nearly 3,000 full-day preschool slots as well, and this is part of last year's budget agreement, or part of the multi-year plan, I should say. However, with all of that said, May revise doesn't do one really critically important thing, and that's update the income eligibility limits for subsidized childcare and the state preschool program. So these income limits are based on the state median income for different sizes of families, and they actually haven't been increased since the 07-08 fiscal year, which means they're actually based on data that are over a decade old. In fact, policymakers have actually decreased these income limits, which happened in 2011. So by taking a look at this chart, you can see that if policymakers updated the income limit using the most recent data, the limit for a family of 3 would actually increase by about $10,000, or 24%. So these outdated income limits have real consequences. Because they are so out of date, parents earning the minimum wage are beginning to lose eligibility for subsidized care. I think many of us know that earning the minimum wage, even a boosted state minimum wage like in California, doesn't get a family close to where they need to be to make ends meet. So as the minimum wage continues to increase in future years, state policymakers need to make sure that they're updating income eligibility limits so families can retain their subsidized care.
Great, thanks, Kristen. So let's talk about a couple of other items that are reflected in the governor's May revision that are not necessarily large impacts on the general fund or as large of an impact on the general fund, but that are addressing long-term obligations and liabilities in the state. And the first of those is that the budget reflects a transportation funding package that the governor and legislature agreed to a number of weeks ago. That package would spend $54 billion over the next 10 years, split evenly between state and local governments. The state pieces of that would go to highway repairs, bridge repairs, improving movement through trade corridors, and reducing congestion. The local side of it would include funding for road repairs, public transit and intercity rail, active transportation projects such as biking and pedestrian corridors and facilities that would then link people to other transit facilities as well. And so those are the sort of overview of how the dollars get spent over the next 10 years or would be spent. This package raises the funding from a series of fuel-related tax increases and vehicle fee increases. So it increases the state gas tax by 12 cents starting this year. It also increases a series of diesel fuel taxes. It imposes a progressively structured vehicle fee that would be based on the value of your car, and it also imposes a zero emissions vehicle fee. And those things combine to put the billions of dollars in place that actually fund these transportation projects. It's worth noting that gas tax piece, which is the one that's received the most attention, obviously, has not been increased in 23 years. And importantly, these revenue sources are all, for the most part, adjusted for inflation each year, starting in 2021, so that they'll increase with economic growth in future years. The other piece of this that we want to talk about that is a complicated proposal from the governor that's still being analyzed. The Legislative Analyst's Office just released their analysis of this proposal earlier this week. It's a proposal that would provide a supplemental payment to the state's employee pension system through CalPERS. Just to give a bit of background here, California is required to make contributions from its general fund in order to pay for state-run retirement systems through CalPERS, the state's employee retirement system, and through CalSTRS, the teacher's retirement system. Those systems aren't currently funded at levels that are keeping up with long-term liabilities, and those unfunded liabilities have been growing recently as a result of lower than expected returns on the fund's investment. And both of the systems, CalPERS and CalSTRS, have made recent decisions to actually lower their expected rate of return on their investments from 7.5% to 7.0%. What that means is that the state will be forced to increase its contributions from the general fund significantly in future years. And so to help address this challenge in the CalPERS arena, the governor is proposing to make a loan of $6 billion from a short-term cash investment account to CalPERS. To go through some of the mechanics without getting too far into the weeds, this essentially refinances dollars that are actually sitting in this short-term cash account that are sitting at an interest rate of less than 1% and moves them to CalPERS, where they would receive, if all were to go as projected, the rate of return that CalPERS is expecting, which is 7%. So it's refinancing a debt that would produce some additional gains, and those gains would go to help offset the additional contributions that the state needs to make to CalPERS in future years. And the loan itself would be repaid by funds from Proposition 2, which we talked about earlier, over the next 8 to 10 years, plus some funds from state special funds. There are several key questions about this proposal, about the mechanisms that it uses, some legal questions about what's allowed, and that analysis will keep going forward. We'll talk about that as one of the questions that's still underway and still being considered as we go forward. But both of those packages, both the transportation package and the CalPERS proposal, are in essence trying to free up some space in the future for the state in terms of general fund obligations in the long term to things like infrastructure and retirement systems. So we're going to talk next about some other elements that are in the state budget, plus what isn't included in the May revision. And so I'm going to start by introducing Sarah Kimberlin.
Thanks, Chris. To start, I want to talk about immigration. The May revision includes some modest funds to respond to federal action on immigration and other issues. These are small amounts of money, relatively speaking, but they can be seen as symbolically significant because aggressive federal enforcement of immigration laws has been an area of particular tension between California and the new federal administration. This is particularly true with regards to the recent executive order seeking to limit federal funding to state and local governments that have sanctuary policies. And I'll note that we have some blog posts on our website that talk about the likely implications of the sanctuary jurisdiction's executive order. So the May revision adds an additional $15 million to support legal services for individuals who are seeking to naturalize or otherwise adjust their immigration status or fight deportation, bringing that total to $30 million. And the May revision also adds $6.5 million to the Department of Justice to respond more broadly to federal actions, not limited just to immigration. Next on cap and trade. California's cap and trade program is a program that sets a statewide limit on the emission of greenhouse gases and authorizes the Air Resources Board to auction off emission allowances with proceeds invested in activities that seek to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there are actually no changes in the May revision on cap and trade, but in the governor's January budget, he did request some action by the legislature. So the existing cap and trade authority expires in 2020. And the governor has noted that the perceived legal uncertainty about the program beyond that time is believed to have contributed to volatile prices in cap and trade auctions. So to address this issue, the governor has called on the legislature to affirm the authority of the Air Resources Board to administer the cap and trade program beyond 2020 with a 2/3 vote. Contingent on this vote, the governor proposes spending $2.2 billion in cap and trade auction proceeds in various areas, including transit, affordable housing, pollution reduction, and other activities that promote environmental sustainability and energy efficiency. And bills have been introduced in the legislature that would extend the cap and trade authority beyond 2020. Next on housing. The May revision, like the governor's January budget, is noteworthy for repeatedly highlighting the seriousness of California's housing crisis while not actually proposing any new state funding to support affordable housing. In fact, the May revision continues to rescind the $400 million that was set aside for affordable housing in last year's budget. The spending of those funds was contingent on the legislature approving the governor's by right proposal, which they did not do. With his by right proposal last year and the language in his January budget, the governor has made it clear that he believes that a key to addressing the housing crisis is removing the regulatory barriers that slow down and stop housing development at the local level. He's also stated that he is committed to working with the legislature on a legislative package to address the state's housing shortage. And the legislature indeed has made housing a major focus this year. More than 130 housing-related bills have been introduced this session. These bills include proposals to address regulatory barriers, as well as proposals to enhance enforcement of existing laws that are intended to ensure that all local jurisdictions develop a fair share of housing, as well as proposals to make significant new state investments in funding for affordable housing development. In terms of funding, it's clear that the governor is not enthusiastic about spending new general fund dollars on housing, nor issuing new bonds for housing, but potentially he could be more open to a dedicated funding stream for affordable housing outside of existing general fund dollars if connected to regulatory reforms. So it'll be important to watch what happens in the legislature with the housing-related bills that are moving through now.
Thank you, Sarah. And we're now going to move to Alyssa Anderson, who's going to talk about the California Earned Income Tax Credit and other elements of the May revision. Alyssa.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So I'm going to be talking about 3 programs that help people with low incomes make ends meet, starting with California's new state earned income tax credit, the Cal EITC. So this is a refundable state tax credit that California created a couple of years ago, and it essentially helps very low earning workers and their families better afford basic necessities. The credit works a little differently than your typical tax credit in that the size of the credit has to be specified in each year's state budget. In previous years, the state EITC was set to equal 85% of the federal EITC, and the governor is proposing to maintain the credit at this size in this year's budget. There is interest in the legislature in expanding the Cal EITC to reach additional low-earning workers, but the governor is not proposing to expand the credit in any way in this year's budget. Also, a key issue that's emerged since the credit was created is that it looks like a large number of people who are eligible for the credit have missed out on it. And part of the challenge with the credit is that it targets people with such low earnings that many are not required to file state income taxes. So it looks like there could be some people who don't realize that they can get cash back from this new credit if they file, even if they're not required to file taxes. So we would argue that there's a lot more that California could do to promote the new state earned income tax credit. And last year's budget provided a small amount of funding to community organizations to help promote the credit. However, the governor is not proposing to maintain those funds in this year's budget. And so a key question going forward is whether the legislature will push to maintain that funding for another year or even expand it in order to continue promoting the new credit. Turning now to CalWORKs. This is California's Welfare to Work program. It essentially provides very modest cash assistance to low-income children and job-related services to their parents. And California cut funding for CalWORKs pretty significantly to help close budget shortfalls that emerged due to the Great Recession. And one consequence of those cuts was that the maximum amount of assistance that is provided to families declined. So for a family of 3, the maximum amount of assistance fell below half the official federal poverty line. And it's remained there for 10 consecutive years, in spite of some modest increases in CalWORKs grants in recent years. So essentially what this means is that CalWORKs on its own doesn't provide enough support to lift families out of deep poverty or to boost their incomes above half the official federal poverty line. In spite of this, the governor is not proposing to make any new additional investments in CalWORKs this year. And then finally, turning to SSI SSP, this is a program that helps low-income seniors and people with disabilities pay for basic living expenses. It's funded with both state and federal dollars, and California made deep cuts to the state portion of these grants, again, to close budget shortfalls several years ago. As a result, the maximum grant for individuals fell below the official federal poverty line and has remained there for 8 years in a row. Now, last year's budget provided a cost of living increase for the state portion of these grants. That was the first cost of living increase in a decade. However, this was just a small step toward restoring the state portion of these grants. With the cost of living increase provided last year, the maximum grant for individuals is still below the federal poverty line. Now, there will be a small increase in SSI SSP grants due to a federal cost of living increase that's anticipated that will go into effect next year. But even with that increase, the maximum grant for individuals will remain below the poverty line. That's it.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. So issues, key questions to watch. I'm sure some of these seem pretty obvious given what we've run through quickly here. But it's important to remember that the May revision itself is not a done deal. It's the governor's next bite at the apple, and our state's legislators are actually going to be deliberating rapidly in the coming weeks to try to figure out how to shape the final budget that package that they send to the governor by midnight, June 15th, as required in the state constitution. So some of the key questions that they'll be dealing with are how to approach this over appropriation in K through 14 education. There's a policy choice being made here. There's also a policy choice being made about the governor's approach to the cost shift to counties that he's mitigated, obviously, but where there's still a cost shift over time. And other choices around the interpretations of Proposition 56, questions about housing. While there isn't a proposal in the May revision, the legislature could still move to approve some or all of the pending package of bills that aim to boost state support for affordable housing, and there's a lot of housing this year, housing proposals this year. And then there are these proposals to do something about Cal EITC or CalWORKs or SSI, SSP, the programs that are designed to most help folks who are low income, in need, and aren't receiving any additional assistance in the governor's proposal. So those are sort of key a question to think about. The last piece, which is more outside of what state legislators can control, is of course what happens at the federal level, what types of cuts might come out of the administration and the Congress in the coming weeks. So we'll be watching that closely, and that will surely provide some pressure and some context in terms of the realm of possibilities that state legislative leaders are considering. So we're going to stop there and move to questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen Bliss.
Thanks, everybody. And just as a reminder, as noted earlier, this is part of our Policy Perspective Speaker Series, a set of events that we do throughout the year, both online and in person around the state. So just as a heads up to keep an eye on our website, calbudgetcenter.org, and also on your email inbox and social media. We'll be announcing future events in the coming weeks and months. So with that, we did want to move into questions and discussion. And as a reminder, you can ask questions via Twitter by tweeting a question at us at Cal Budget Center, or also via the Policy Perspectives hashtag. But also there's the questions pane that you can see in your GoToWebinar panel that you can use to ask questions directly of us. We have a number of questions, a few questions already that have come in, but we have still about 20 minutes allotted for questions, so encouraging you to send in any questions or comments that you have, and we'll pass that along to the speakers to respond to them. I want to start out first with a question about the InHome supportive services funding and that deal between the county, the counties and the governor. And the question is, goes to sort of the flexibility counties have along those lines. And the question is for Scott, and is, does each county have a choice about whether or not to divert the county medical services program and other accounts in terms of funding? So Scott, I think you'll take that one.
Hi, so my understanding of the proposal in the May revision is that this is something the counties shall do rather than what the counties may do. So in other words, when the proposal indicates that vehicle license fee growth revenues generated through the 1991 realignment, sorry, that's all Sacramento speak, those dollars shall be redirected for IHSS purposes for years 1, 2, and 3, and then those redirections would be cut in half for years 4 and 5. So that's just based on my understanding of what I have seen in the public realm. So if anyone on the webinar actually has alternative information, please feel free to let us know. But I think this is something that a redirection of special fund revenues that shall occur, that would occur over the next few years if this proposal is enacted into law.
Great. Thank you, Scott. The next question that we have is about some of the intricacies of Prop 98 and K-14 education funding. It's a good question. It's a little bit in the weeds, as they say, and so I think Jonathan will be able to sort of help unpack it a little bit and sort of give a kind of brief reply, and then if there's still more detail needed on that, we can follow up offline after the webinar. But this question goes to the suspension of Prop 98, and so the question is to Jonathan, can you explain the suspension of Prop 98 Test 3B in the budget? And the broader question is, will that smooth out education funding increases so that they're less volatile? And I'm sort of putting that volatile in quotes just to note that that's sort of in the words of the question and asker. So I'll put the question to Jonathan.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So as I mentioned in my presentation, the governor's May revision provides more funding for Prop 98 than would otherwise be required, but it also establishes contingencies to deal with the possibility that revenues come in lower than expected, or the Prop 98 guarantee falls in both the budget year and future years. One of those contingencies is this arcane part of state law, notably not the state constitution, which is this item called Test 3B. And what that basically is, it's sometimes known as the equal pain, equal gain provision of Prop 98. What it basically means is that it's intended to basically make Prop 98 grow the same, or at least as much as, the non-Prop 98 side of the budget in certain years. So the Test 3B provision is an attempt to try and, in certain years, make sure that 98, that is funding for K-12 schools and community colleges, is going to grow as much as the non-98 side of the budget. What the governor has done as in the May revision is to signal and to say that they're suspending, that is not including these payments from 2016-17 through 2020-21. So this would be sort of an agreement about what would happen in future years. And what that would do is, in essence, I think I would craft it more as a safety valve, or a way that the state is saying, sure, we're providing more than the 98 guarantee that would otherwise provide in the budget year, but we are not going to provide monies above and beyond what we have signaled we will provide in the Prop 98 guarantee by various contingencies. One of these being suspending this provision, that is the Test 3B for provision. So to answer the question, I don't necessarily see this as a means of getting rid of what is some consider volatility. What I do see it as is a means for the state to say, while they're providing more money than is otherwise provided, than would otherwise be guaranteed, they would now say, well, we're going to do that, but we're not going to be providing anything above and beyond, which was what S3B was designed to do. I hope that helps answer the question, but I'm, of course, happy to take further questions offline if that's helpful.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. The next question we have, and just as a quick kind of reminder as to where we are, we have about 12 minutes left on the webinar, and we've gotten a lot of great questions, so just please continue to use the question pane or Twitter to shoot those our way. We'll get to as many of those as we can. We'll generally take them in the order that we got them. But again, thanks for those. This next question is also on Prop 56 and the use of those funds, and it sort of goes also to the sort of federal context. And the question is whether Prop 56 dollars can be used to backfill Medi-Cal funds if the federal policymakers do cut funding to Medi-Cal.
So the question of whether Proposition 56 tobacco tax revenues could be used for what some would argue are just standard general fund purposes really doesn't relate to what's going on in the outside world. It doesn't matter to the initiative, Prop 56, whether the feds are giving us more money for Medi-Cal or giving us less money. The initiative itself and the wording and the interpretation of that wording is what would come into play, really, and it really would have to reflect the willingness on all parties involved to sort of agree on a reasonable interpretation of what the language of Proposition 56 means. So you could imagine a world where we face deep cuts in federal funding for our Medi-Cal program, as the House of Representatives envisions in their American Health Care Act, as they call it. In that situation, major interest groups and policymakers in California may agree that perhaps it makes more sense to use Prop 56 dollars to help support the underlying Medi-Cal program rather than providing provider rate increases or other kinds of program expansions. In other words, it might be hard to justify those kinds of expansions, which could be seen as maybe patching a hole in your roof when in fact the foundation of your program is crumbling, and maybe that's where the dollars should go, shoring up the foundation. So a lot of it will just come down sort of to the politics of it, and whether, regardless of the circumstances, whether those who back the initiative as well as those in the governor's office and the legislature can reach some kind of compromise on what it is the voters actually meant when they approved Proposition 56.
Thank you, Scott. We have a number of questions about various elements of housing and sort of the housing debate and the status of funding for affordable housing in California. I'm going to kind of draw a few of those together and just sort of raise the question of, and there's probably a number of people who could speak to this, but raise the question of what sort of what sort of conditions, funding or otherwise, even in terms of where the debate is right now, would be needed to move some of these proposals forward. So trying to get a little bit of a sense of some of the bills moving through and whether whether there's a consensus in the Capitol about what it might take to move some of these forward, and sort of the role that different groups and and advocates can play in advancing it. So the broader question really goes to not just specifically kind of the funding picture, but also sort of bigger picture, what sort of things would be helpful in advancing policy-wise or otherwise, affordable housing support in California.
I think it's important to note that there's a lot of action on housing in the legislature right now. So there's many different proposals relating to funding as well as regulatory reform. I don't know that it's clear that there's consensus right now on the best approach to, for example, establishing a permanent funding source for affordable housing. There are multiple proposals out there. So I think some of what's going to happen in the next few weeks will be seeing if some consensus can be arrived at as these different proposals move through. And I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to add anything as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think something that Sarah said earlier is important to understand, at least in the context of the budget deliberations and how the budget deliberations actually affect legislation that's moving, which is the politics of this are such that the governor has drawn a line in the sand about, as Sarah said earlier, wanting to see some regulatory reform before signing a budget package or legislation that would actually provide additional funding to support the building and supply of affordable housing. And so I don't think that issue has changed from last year's enacted budget and the $400 million he put forward that he's now rescinding in this year's proposal. And in many respects, sort of how consensus gets built will largely have to deal with the reality that meeting the governor somewhere along the lines of what he's proposing will probably be necessary to get him to sign off.
Thank you both. We still have about 5 minutes to go, and as a reminder, we're taking questions right now or comments. Please use the questions panel to ask those. We have a couple questions that come back to the federal policy context, in some cases asking about specific pieces of it. As Chris noted earlier, we'll be issuing a number of analyses in the coming weeks as more details emerge from Washington in terms of budget proposals at the federal level. But the broader question that we're getting sort of different pieces of is, assuming that there is, as as everyone's expecting, some potentially harmful proposals in terms of funding for income supports and other sort of services for low-income individuals and families. So assuming that there will be potential cuts coming down the pike from DC, what are the sort of policy levers that state policymakers have to potentially address those, given that, as has been noted, the current May revision reflects sort of current federal law and current federal spending level. So the issue is getting at sort of what sort of things could policymakers be doing either through the budget or beyond as more details come into view to help backfill or otherwise address potential cuts at the federal level.
Yeah, that's a tough question, and it's certainly the one that is ever present on the minds of state leaders right now. Being able to answer that question depends almost entirely on what the scale of the potential hit would be to the state budget. So if you look at what we know so far about the House proposal to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, the state is estimating that there's an initial hit of about $6 billion from the changes to Medi-Cal, and that because of those changes not essentially being capped from year in, year out going forward, if that were to get passed, that hit could grow to well into the $25, $26, $27 billion range over time. And that's a big hit, and it means that there aren't that many levers the state has to pull in the budget that wouldn't involve significant cuts if they didn't find other revenues in order to pay for whatever level of services the state decided it could try to maintain on its own. Now that's those numbers are big, and they represent in many ways sort of the potentially biggest hit perhaps. But some of the other federal budget proposals and tax proposals would likely have other price tags, and everything kind of varies by scale. So a lot of it depends on what becomes real, and we're still a long way right now from knowing what's going to be real. We don't know that the Senate will actually even advance the House proposal as it's currently structured. We don't know whether they'll get that process done in the current fiscal year. We don't know how much they'll be able to get done in terms of federal proposals for the fiscal year 2018. And we don't know whether federal tax reform proposals will get wrapped into those federal budget proposals, or they'll try to move separately. And so there's a lot of unknowns out there, and the sort of the scope of the unknowns in terms of how many unknowns there are, plus this potential scale, means that state leaders are probably going to be very careful in decisions that they make, both in this budget and legislatively in the near term.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I think, Jonathan, also you've done a little bit of looking into other things on the education front that might be relevant to potential proposals coming down from Washington.
Sure. So as Chris mentioned, we really don't know where any of the federal proposals will go, but we did put out a piece in the last month or so looking at Title II funding. That's funding for professional development for the state's teachers, and also helps to provide dollars for class size reduction across the state. And our analysis pointed to the fact that inland parts of the state, especially in the San Joaquin Valley, would be disproportionately affected by those cuts. One of the options the state could pursue, if in fact those proposals move forward, and we are hearing word that that is going to be part of the president's proposal next week, is the state could backfill those cuts, provide dollars specifically geared towards some aspect of teacher professional development or class size reduction in the areas of the state that are hardest hit. So that is one way that in fact the state could mitigate what's happening or potentially happening at the federal level.
Great, thank you for that, Jonathan. And with that, we are right up against our end time of 11:30, and so I want to again thank everybody for the great questions. Where possible, we have a number of people that reached out with specific questions to a couple of the analysts. We'll try to follow up with those individuals in the coming days, but thanks for the great questions and also for the comments from our analysts. With that, I do want to move us toward wrapping up today's webinar. Just a couple quick reminders. As mentioned earlier, we'll be emailing out the slide deck from today and also a link to the video recording of today's webinar. And also as a reminder, we will be in the coming weeks and beyond weighing in on the state budget debate and also on the various dimensions of the federal budget debate. So keep an eye on us on social media, also on our website. You see the URL and the Twitter handle here. And we look forward to continuing to work with you to advance smart public policy choices that benefit all Californians. With that, I want to again thank you for joining us today, and we hope you appreciate our webinar and enjoyed it. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks.